Hello, everyone, and glad you could join us. I'm your co-host, Rose Schooler, here with my fellow traveler and friend, Dana Boss. This podcast, Lead Up, focuses on the intersection of leadership and management with real life. Managing a team and leading a group can be super lonely and really demanding at times, and we see you and we celebrate you. So come hang by the virtual water cooler with two very different perspectives on this topic. Mine, a 30-year career at Intel, ending as a corporate VP, and Dana with a long career in management and leadership development in many different industries. So welcome to Lead Up, and thank you for joining us. So Dana, if you recall in our communications episode, before we began, I noted that neither of us were CCOs, Chief Communication Officers.
Correct.
And you know we love to keep it real in this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So what I thought would be fun is to have a guest that is actually an expert in communications. So with that, I would love to introduce my former colleague and my very dear friend, Tara Smith. And Tara is, just to keep it simple and keep it real, she's a freaking rock star. She was promoted to the Chief Comms Officer in November at 2020 at Intel, and she spent more than 20 years overseeing strategic communication programs for a bunch of tech companies. And prior to joining Intel, she was the Senior Vice President at We Communications, and she had a really cool gig where she served as the executive lead on the agency for Microsoft's business, heading up both Windows and the OEM teams. She's also had senior level comms roles at Marquee, a software startup, and Sterling Communications, a Silicon Valley-based PR firm. So with that, I would like to welcome Tara.
Thank you, Rose. It's great to be here. And I promise I did not pay Rose to say any of that. Welcome.
So Tara, I know we broke your heart in the previous pod when we noted how challenging comms can be. And I think we actually used the word tiring. So we wanted to bring you on and have you share your perspective. So let's jump into a few questions for you. Okay. Some of the things that we noted in the pod that we think are critical to consider in effective internal communications. And if you remember, we kind of narrowed it down because it's such a broad field, were things like simplicity. Keep it simple in the messaging. Make sure you use a story to tell, to get the narrative across. Be consistent and predictable in your internal comms. Make sure you're aware of your audience. And then when you say something, you actually do it. You have a bias for action. My first question is super simple. What did we miss in that summary?
I thought it was a good list. One of my interesting observations is everyone on the planet thinks they're a comms expert. So very happy to be here and give you the real scoop. But I did think it was a good list. I would definitely add to it in a few spots.
That's great.
So number one, and this is true of all communications, but definitely for internal communications as well, you have to be clear on your desired outcome. So you talk about knowing your audience and understanding your audience, but what do you want that audience to think, to feel, to do? What does success look like for you? And that's really important because that's going to dictate your comm strategy. And a lot of times, particularly if you're dealing with something tougher, maybe it's a more sensitive topic, you have to be intellectually honest about what is that outcome going to be. If you have a tough message, you're going to get a tough outcome. And I think that's where sometimes people go astray and maybe they have unrealistic expectations of how a comms is going to land. So that's number one. Now, you talked about authenticity a lot in episode 7. And what I was fascinated by is it then didn't make the list that you said. So authenticity is important. And I think you really nailed it on the head in that episode where you talked about how leaders have to be hands-on. And this is really important. Audiences, employees, they can sniff out BS so quickly and they'll just tune you right out. So I thought you made the good point. You have to be hands-on. Totally fine if someone else drafts something for you, but you have to make it your own. It has to be real.
So Tara,
yeah.
Before you jump ahead, can I throw some of my own words at that?
Yeah.
So you're not a fan of spin.
No.
That's what I always think of as spin. So
no.
How about a comment on spin?
Well, okay. So this happens all the time. People come to me with a problem. They have something they want to communicate around and they've already spun it for me. They're handing me messages. They want me to go make PR around it or deliver some communications. That is not helpful for anybody because what you actually need for that authenticity, this is all part of authenticity, is facts. What is the business truth? What is the product truth? What is that outcome? But if someone is giving me their own spin on it, I'm going to miss things. And communications are only as good as the foundation they're built on, the old garbage in, garbage out. So give me the facts. I'll work on the messaging with you.
That is so spot on. I've never thought about it that way, but you're so right. A lot of times people approach and they've already done what they think is the messaging or the quote unquote spin.
And they miss that next level of detail where maybe there's some ugly that we need to be realistic about or we need to plan for. So that's really important. I think the last thing I'd call out, you talk about bias towards action, taking action. I would just say complement that with a willingness to pause, to take a beat, to listen to feedback, but also to give things time to just breathe and settle. What I see a lot of times is companies, maybe they communicate something, they get frustrated. It's not landing, it's not right. Someone is unhappy. And what do? They have a knee-jerk response and they change it. Well, now you're flip-flopping and now nothing will stick. So just give it some time and see how things land.
Let me ask a follow-up to that. And I'm thinking mostly internal communications right now, just because that was our previous episode. No, I mean, it doesn't have to be from Intel, but just in general, like what is an example of that internally, where you've delivered a message and there's a temptation to have a knee-jerk response because the message isn't landing well?
I think it can span just about anything. But if I look at a lot of companies right now, a lot of companies are dealing with some pretty tough situations. Maybe they're dealing with a layoff, a budget cut. Those things are hard. They're hard for us as humans to communicate. They're hard for humans to hear. And the automatic response might be, hey, I need to make it better. Let's communicate more. Let's communicate different. And what really happens is you just need to give time for people to process. And it's never going to be any easier. If you're talking about a layoff or something like that, it just is not going to be easy. So resist that temptation. There's also a very famous saying in communications that if you're explaining, you're losing. And I think that's something that executives will get into a lot of. They feel like they keep having to explain and make their case. It doesn't matter. If someone doesn't like what you're saying, they're not going to like it anymore if you spend 10 more minutes talking about it.
Great point. And what also comes to mind is so many companies right now struggling with return to work after COVID. You're reading again and again in the papers or what have you about how companies communicate it. It's a tough message for many people. They're struggling. The employees are struggling. The companies are struggling with how to navigate that.
Yeah. And I thought you touched on empathy last talked about that. And again, that's so important as a communicator. You have to have empathy with the audience because that's the best thing you do is try and put yourself in their shoes on how does it feel.
All right. So you also heard us speak about consistency and predictability, and that's critical in internal comms as well as external. I really do see this as one of the eternal dynamics that I see in organizations in any industry or sector, and also in any size. It amazes me that an organization of 50 people will communicate about comms the same way an organization of 50,000 people communicates about it. Like, it's not enough. From an employee's perspective, it's not enough. And from a management perspective, they're like, we communicate all the time. We have forums. We send out news updates. We send out business updates. And so it settles into this frustration all around. And I'm just curious what thoughts you might have for how a senior team could reset and break through that frustration somehow, that dynamic that can so easily happen.
Let's be real, it is frustrating. And certainly as a communicator, I feel that way too. But I also have to take accountability that if my messages aren't landing, then that is on me as a communicator. I can't pin that on my audience. So what am I doing to think about why maybe it's not landing? So, a couple things on that. Number one, there's just a reality. It takes time for a message to land. In fact, you'll often hear communicators say, you got to say it and say it again. And by the time you're so sick of saying it, that's when it finally starts to land. But the temptation is people get tired, they get frustrated, switch to a different message, and then nothing lands. So you really have to be patient that it takes consistency over time for something to really stick. And then you also have to understand that audiences and people, we all consume information in different ways. We learn in different ways. Some are visual, some need to hear it, some need to be hands-on, some it's a combination. So really think through, are you building in enough different types of assets and forums to really make sure a message comes through? Do you have visuals? Have you created, maybe it's a podcast? Are you really thinking about your audience and how they're going to consume that information and giving them multiple ways to interact with it and engage with it?
one last follow up. One thing I sometimes have sensed doing a lot of the kind of org assessment and org development work I do is that when people are complaining about insufficient communication, that's sometimes actually not the root problem. It's a symptom of something else. And I'm just curious if you've ever seen that, where, people come and say this communications just isn't working, or the staff, everyone's complaining there isn't enough. And sometimes when you peel back that onion, it's really not about the communications, it's about something else. And I'm just curious if you've ever run into something like that.
Yeah, I run into that all the time. And a lot of times it's a way of people telling you they don't actually like what you're telling them, but they're going to pick on the comms versus the message because that's a safer place to start. So there's also a question of, have you created the psychological safety in your environment to have people be upfront about what they're really complaining about?
I love that response, Tara. We just did an episode on psychological safety and creating a safe space to bring the authentic truth to the table, no matter what the topic. I love that example. And I love that you keep going back to the audience. I heard this quote once that's going to stick with me forever. The message lies with the audience, and the audience owns the message. And I think when you keep that, and correct me if you don't agree, but when you put that audience at the center of anything you do or anything you communicate. You and I have been through this many times. There's often multiple audiences with multiple perspectives. I think you do a better job preparing for the questions and the answers and the response that you may get. So I love that response.
Well, and taking time to think through those different audiences and how you want to prioritize them is also important because you're never going to make everybody happy. So I think that's also something that is important. You cannot deliver a message that will universally make everybody happy. And you just need to accept that.
That's a great tip.
And so once then you acknowledge that, and then you can kind of prioritize. But I also want to say there's a lot of really poor comms out there. So we have to leave room for that. And again, that goes to the authenticity. If you're parroting off a bunch of bullet points someone else drafted for you and you don't believe in it, well, of course, that's not going to land. And I do see a lot of leaders doing that.
That's actually an interesting segue to my next question. With internal comms, there is a lot of interaction with corporate executives and corporate and executive staff. Do you have any tips? Our audience is a lot of kind of new managers, new leaders, middle managers. Do you have any tips relative to communications on how you work in preparation to working with that executive audience?
It's going to vary by situation, vary by executive. But I do spend a lot of time getting executive audiences aligned and, to use a phrase that you've used before on this show, rowing in the same direction. Because a lot of times what you have, different points of view, different agendas, people aren't working off the same set of facts. So you really have to take the step back and say, hey, what are the facts? What is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the outcome we're trying to drive with what audience? And just really getting on that same page so that you know what you're trying to solve for. Again, a lot of people come to me with messaging already baked. They come to me with a tactic in mind. My personal favorite is we need an exec memo from XYZ and we need it tomorrow.
Right.
And I go, okay, take a breath. Let's talk about what we're trying to solve for. Is it truly just a one and done memo? Probably not. So let's have a conversation and then we'll come up with a communication strategy together. And that's the important part is you really have to come to a common understanding so that they feel like you're trying to help them. You're in it with them. And then you can actually get to the strategy piece, which it may or may not include an exec memo in the end. Probably not.
Rose, I'm curious. You were an executive and Tara, you have a high opinion of Tara. I know that.
I do.
So what is it that Tara did that or does or doesn't do that made you feel like she was being a true partner?
Oh, that's great. I just got spun on my own podcast, our own podcast. All the questions back at me. I think there was a few things. So let me just start with, I think this role requires a sense and a behavior of incredible calm. And no matter the topic, Tara had this just calming effect of everybody in the meeting, in the room, working on the communications. She was also, to go back to a previous comment that she made, was very rooted in the facts and the truth and started with that. And let me just tell you for the audience, Tara and I have worked on a lot of really difficult comps together. And she would always bring the table back to the facts and the truth. And then she was incredibly detail oriented on her audience and disciplined on the preparation for the Q&A such that we were all prepared, because often there is an owner of the message and an owner of the content, but there are many that have to deliver it. And she was always very diligent about making sure that all of us were comfortable and well prepared for the questions that came after the pause.
Tara, if you've listened to the pod at all, we're often bringing up current affairs or things happening in the culture or social issues for teachable moments. So we're curious if there are any recent events where you've seen exceptionally great communications or the opposite, room for improvement. And again, it could be internal or external, depending on where your head goes with this.
It's a little tougher just by its very nature. Companies don't necessarily share what they're doing internally. So I'll use a couple of external examples. There's lots to pick from in terms of who's doing it poorly. I think there's a large adult beverage company out there right now that is in the thick of it. I don't know that we need to belabor that one. It's been pretty well dissected. But I would say that that's an example of maybe some things not to do, and some lessons can be learned from that. But in terms of who's doing it well, I'll give a couple of examples on the tech side. AI is super hot right now. Everyone's talking about AI. One that I've enjoyed is, Microsoft always does a good job on these topics. In terms of, they came out with a pretty aggressive and provocative launch for the new Bing that really tapped into that industry conversation. So it was interesting how they did that. They don't just focus on the tech or one facet of the story. They really go after multiple angles and multiple audiences. So for instance, they talk about the tech, but they also get out there and talk about the policy. And so what they do is they really reinforce their position across a lot of different audiences, but in a very consistent way. So great job to the Microsoft team on that one. If I can call out the Intel team, pat that team on the back a little bit. Similar thing with semiconductors and the supply chain. Very consistent message around the importance of a geographically balanced and resilient supply chain, again, across multiple audiences, across the tech side, across the policy side. So I think there's a lot of learnings there in terms of how companies and brands can think about 360-degree communications across multiple factors of the same topic, hitting multiple audiences.
That was awesome. Thank you. You have, as I noted in the introduction, spent a couple decades now in your field, learning and watching evolution and change. So what's really fascinating to me is the role that social media has really played in comms in terms of the speed of information. What's your lens on how social media has changed your job, your role, both pluses and also minuses? What are some of the challenges it's created?
It's a game changer. And I think this has been true for a while. And I think it's a game changer both for good and for bad. We'll talk about the positives first. Obviously, it is a great way to get a message out broadly, very quickly. And particularly if you're an individual or if you're a smaller company, it can be very cost effective. It can be fast. You can be pretty quick twitch in how you execute that. So in some ways, it's an equalizer in that a smaller company or voice can have big impact. Now, on the flip side, I think we can also say we've seen lots of examples where it's been abused. Misinformation is everywhere. It can be hard to tell now what's real, what's fake. You have things like deepfakes popping up. So how do you make sure that what you're actually interacting with is real? On younger audiences, for example. And I think we've all seen those examples of brands too, where they're so eager to get out on that next great social media platform. Hey, we need to be on TikTok, that they can have some pretty significant and embarrassing missteps. Again, it's being really thoughtful about who do you need to reach? What is the message you need to land? And thinking about what platform and what approach is best. It's not going to be one size fits all. And in my case, anytime I come up with a plan now, I factor social in, even if it's a very deliberate choice not to be on social media. And that's part of a plan too. So just really taking the time to think through, again, what is the outcome you want and with what audience is pretty important.
So Tara, there is a point in the pod when we're wrapping up where Dana and I rip through some hot takes, things that we've learned through either our guests or our dialogue or the topic that we're hitting. So we're going to bust off into hot takes right now.
Hot take.
So Dana, do you want to go first?
I will go first. And then once we're done with hot takes, there's one final bonus question for Tara that I have that we'll end on. My hot takes, first of all, just such good learnings that it's hard to just say a couple, but
Yeah, I got a long list over here, sister.
yeah. I like how you keep it real, Tara. If it's a tough message, it's going to be a tough conversation. It's going to be a tough outcome. And no amount of wordsmithing or crafting the message can change that. And I really like keeping it real, like by just being like, let's be clear if it's going to be a tough message. And then also let the message land, resist that knee-jerk reaction to change it because your people might not be happy with it. Of course, start with the facts. I remember once, this was just role playing, but I was in a session where I was asked to be part of a group role playing. How do we discuss return to work after COVID? So we were all asked to have different points of view and blah, 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 blah. And then we got feedback from the rest of the group. And one person said, you talked about everything but the facts. You didn't talk about what's the risk for disease transmission. You didn't talk about this. And it just amazed me. We hadn't. All we'd talked about were like perceptions and emotions and this and that. First, start with the facts. That's a great hot take for me.
And my hot takes are I try and keep them brief. If you're explaining, you're losing. I love that. That was so powerful. And then I'm an engineer by education. And, I lost that a long time ago, but I still like formulas. So I created one off of the commentary about time. And I said, patience over time gives you your consistency. So take that pause, right? You need to have the time as part of the equation. So we have a bonus question.
Yes.
To end the pod. Go ahead, Dana, hit it.
We are a leadership and management podcast, and most of our episodes have been about working as a leader of an organization or a team. And you obviously have a large organization and team reporting into you. I'm curious when you think of enabling your team, and if you want, you can just think of your direct staff, enabling them to succeed in what is clearly a challenging role that people will come to you with things already baked, and you've got to kind of try to put the brakes on and think back. How do you enable your staff or the staff you're trying to grow in their competency to succeed in what can be a very challenging role as a comms
So a
person?
lot of it comes down to, I think, the same principles I've talked about in terms of coaching people to ask the tough questions. Hey, what are the facts? What is the desired outcome? But I also think a big piece of it is in this field, you do have to learn by doing and trying what works. And that's going to be different for everyone. And also people have different perspectives. And I like trying new things and hearing and learning myself. So I think it's a combination of coaching based on what I've seen work, but also giving people the freedom to learn on their own. There's lots of textbooks and advice that talks about failure is the best way to learn. And hopefully, I don't want to set anyone up for failure, but sometimes you learn your best lessons that way. And so making mistakes is a way to just keep progressing. And so I do try to give people the freedom to learn and explore and help me better.
I'm going to bring it home, Dana. So Tara, this was absolutely fantastic. Your responses were very intentional. I think will help our audience significantly as they work through comms challenges that just about everybody in every role at some point in their career are going to run into. So Tara, thank you. As we always close, a shout out to our sound engineer, Chris Byrne, and we will talk to you next time on Lead Up.
All right, that's it. Thank you for spending some of your precious time with us today. Odds are you don't have a lot of it, and we appreciate you listening in. And we'd love to hear from you. What are your questions or thoughts on the topic of management and leadership in real life? Send us an email. We will discuss your question or thought if you send it, and you can find our email on our podcast landing page. So until next time, cheers to all of you out there doing your best to deliver for your teams, your organizations, and yourselves.